Your half-sheet today is a little bit different. There's a little bit more room for some notes, but you have a picture there that we're going to talk about. It was 609 BC. Geopolitical changes were happening all over the Middle East. And while it would be a couple of decades before it actually happened, the southern kingdom of Judah was about to collapse. In that same year, 609, the God-fearing and courageous king Josiah died. While King Josiah had been loved by God and loved God greatly, served as a righteous monarch for nearly 30 years, he made a bad final decision to go to war against Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. Even though Judah and Egypt were not at war, Josiah would not listen to reason, and he went off to battle in the valley of Megiddo. Armageddon, that's where that comes from. And he was killed by the army. And as the nation mourns the loss of Josiah, they set up his son Jehoahaz as king. Every Hebrew king from this point forward would be known and remembered in the scriptures by this phrase: he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So with Egypt's victory, Pharaoh began to exercise control over Judah. Pharaoh put Jehoahaz in chains and appointed his own choice for king, one of Josiah's other sons. Pharaoh demanded that the Jews pay a tribute to him of silver and gold. However, 4 years later, a new power was taking control of the Middle East: the Babylonians. They defeated Pharaoh's army at Carchemish near the Euphrates River. That battle determined the rise of the Babylonian Empire. And here's a curious aside for those of you who love history. Carchemish is the ancient site for a town by a different name, which is at the border between Syria and Turkey. It happens to be right inside the exact same territory where ISIS now has control. But back to the Bible. 605 BC, the kingdom of Judah was no longer in control or under the control of Egypt, but now under the control of the Babylonians. The conquering general was Nebuchadnezzar. As part of his war treasures, Nebuchadnezzar took with him items from Jerusalem's temple and Jewish captives, and among those captives was a teenager named Daniel, along with his 3 friends. During that same time, the prophet Jeremiah was preaching against Jerusalem and preaching inside Jerusalem against the wicked kings. He was a contemporary of Daniel. And as a boy or a teen, Daniel may have actually heard him preach. But even if he didn't, Jeremiah had been preaching his message repeatedly. 70 years were ordained for Judah to be exiled. Daniel and his 3 friends were among the first to experience that exile personally. While Nebuchadnezzar allowed the Hebrews to have their own king, whoever did rule had to answer to him first. And over the next decade or so, Judah's kings would vacillate between promising to be loyal to Nebuchadnezzar and rebelling against him. In 597 BC, as King Jehoiakim refused to submit, Nebuchadnezzar sent his armies again, and this time took control of the capital, Jerusalem. Upon his return to the east, Nebuchadnezzar took with him even more captives, 10,000 Jews, the king's son, and another prophet, Ezekiel. Jeremiah, along with the other messengers of God, continued to warn the nation that things were going to get worse if they did not repent. But the population refused to listen. Furthermore, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations and defiling the temple of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. Several years later, the final Judea king, Zedekiah, rebelled, and Nebuchadnezzar had enough. So for the 3rd time, he marched against Jerusalem to stop it once and for all. The siege lasted 1.5 years. Then Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple and the capital city in 586 BC. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, spared neither young man nor young woman, old man or aged. God handed over to them all of Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became his servants to him and to his sons until the kingdom of Persia came into power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. This was the context for the writings of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, all contemporaries of one another. For the Jewish people, this was a terribly dark period, second only to their 40-year or 400 years of exile in Egypt. Their land was lost, their worship site decimated, their kingdom destroyed, and their God was disciplining them for their disobedience and idolatry. By 586, when the temple and the capital fell, Jeremiah had escaped to Egypt. But Ezekiel, Daniel, and his 3 friends had been taken away to Babylon, where they had been living for almost 2 decades by this point. However, Daniel lived all the way through the 70 years of exile. And during his life as an advisor to the highest officials of the Babylonian government, he wrote down a picture of hope. In fact, Daniel confirmed that God's punishment of Judah would not last forever. So even during their time away from their land, the limits on their worship and isolation that they experienced as being minorities in a different country, the Israelites could know that their experience was not the end of their story. They had something to look forward to, just as we do. The truth is, we're both looking forward to the coming kingdom. Now, for us to recognize what is still ahead prophetically from our point of view at this point in time, our understanding of the book of Daniel is critical. In order to grasp Jesus' words to his disciples about the coming kingdom and to make sense of all the images and timelines that you find in the book of Revelation, Daniel is the book to study. It's the key. It's through Daniel that God reveals himself as the ultimate overseer of man. It's God that supervises and allows the kingdom of this world to rise and fall throughout history. That, in fact, can be described as one of the key themes of the book of Daniel, found in chapter 5. The Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them any one he wishes. So don't get discouraged when the elections don't go as you had hoped, and somebody's in power that breaks your heart. God's got a plan for all this. Written in the 6th century BC, Daniel is the original apocalyptic book of the Bible. And his book is the key to understanding the other apocalyptic book of the New Testament, Revelation. And while we may think of dark days and destruction when we hear the word apocalypse, please remember the Greek word simply means to be revealed or revelation. It is the apocalypse of Jesus Christ. Opening statement, Revelation 1:1. For all the images and the symbols contained in each of these records, New Testament or Old Testament, both books do not leave us without answers. In many cases, the images that caused consternation and worry to Daniel and then later to John as he wrote the Revelation are explained by God in those very same writings. It is through Daniel that God delivers his message concerning a time frame dealing with his people, Israel. And Daniel is the one who describes the kingdoms that would exercise influence over the earth until the arrival of the Antichrist, followed by the eternal kingdom to come. So the book of Daniel is not just about Israel's future, but also a record of Gentile future in relationship to Israel. Through dreams and visions, Daniel outlines what was ahead for the Babylonian kingdom, for the remainder of the Old Testament, for national Israel, for the Gentile nations, for an evil world ruler, and for the rule of the promised one. You ready to start? As the book of Daniel begins, Daniel is in the middle of his 2nd year of training to become a servant directly to the king's court. In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me and I want to know what it means." He didn't tell him what it was. And when none of the counselors of the king could identify for him the content or the interpretation of the dream, he ordered that all such wise men be killed. Daniel, still a young man, gathers his closest friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and pleads with them to plead with God to pray that they might understand what God had given to Nebuchadnezzar. God answers those prayers. And Daniel is asks to be taken to Nebuchadnezzar because God gave him not only the content of the dream, but the understanding of the dream as well. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you lay on your bed are these. As you were lying there, O king, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealers of mystery showed you what's going to happen." The dream was about a huge human figure made up of different materials. Verse 31, Daniel 2. "You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on the threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth." Next, the interpretation is given. Verse 37. "You, O king, are the king of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things into pieces, so it will crush and break all the others." Now, we'll pick up the rest of the interpretation in a moment, but I'd like to spend a moment considering the difference between the gold and silver and from that point forward. Considered an apologetic presented in anticipation of those who study history. In truth, the Medo-Persian was bigger than the Babylonian. You see? In truth, the Greek Empire was bigger than the Medo-Persian. You see? And the Roman Empire was bigger than any of the three. The term inferior is not a reference to size and strength, obviously. The actual physical value of the materials decreased from gold to iron, but their relative physical strength increased, iron being the last. So historians have suggested that Daniel's comment about being inferior or less than Babylon is a reference to lacking the central authority and organization that Nebuchadnezzar was so known for compared to later leaders. From another perspective, arguments have been made, and they're valid, I would think, in some case, that these Gentile kingdoms became more and more inferior because of moral decay and disunity. According to Daniel, the world's kingdoms are not moving towards utopia, but in the opposite direction. Now, I find this fascinating in light of our current Gentile leaders. By the way, if they're not Jewish leader, they're a Gentile leader. The United Nations exists out of a presupposition that together we can accomplish peace as we evolve into a higher, more civilized humanity. The religious beliefs, yes, religious beliefs behind both social or biological evolution are what drive world leaders, including our United States leaders, to believe that humanity can bring heaven to earth. God's word paints the complete opposite picture. This concept of man's kingdoms becoming inferior contradicts the evolutionists' interpretation of human history. Instead of man beginning in the dust and consummating in fine gold, God reveals that man, in the times of the Gentiles, to begin with fine gold and end in dust. So Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is the gold, we're clearly said so, followed by a silver and bronze kingdom, each one less than the first. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things into pieces, so it will crush and break others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes are partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end. But it will itself endure forever. The image of this unusual statue does not give us a lot of information to identify the four kingdoms in world history beyond the gold, which is explained very specifically. But coupled with Daniel's vision in chapter 7 and 8, the next three kingdoms become more clear. While not everybody agrees, the vision of the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream identifies four kingdoms that would reach from Daniel's day to the appearing of the promised one. They are Babylon, with relative dates connected, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire under Alexander, and the Roman Empire. While there are symbols of precious metals and clay involved in these things, it's clear from Daniel's words that all four kingdoms were expected to be physical, earthly kingdoms, including the fifth kingdom that would forever replace all previous empires. And if you know your history, Jesus was born in the Roman Empire when they were in control of the known world. The other three Gentile kingdoms all rose and fell by the time that Christ arrived in Bethlehem. But if you look at a map now, you notice that there is no Roman Empire. So our method of Bible study that we laid out in the first couple of weeks, our hermeneutic, if you will, becomes very critical at this point. Read the description of the fifth kingdom again before we jump in. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on the threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor it will be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. Historically, we have not seen Rome replaced in that kind of manner, nor have we seen this fifth kingdom take over in that kind of manner. As a result, not everybody believes that God's kingdom, represented by this stone, should be considered physical, but that a spiritual kingdom began with Jesus. Now, Jesus did come to announce the kingdom. I showed you that last week. It's all throughout the New Testament Gospels. But Jesus also promised that the kingdom fulfillment was still ahead after his death and resurrection, after his ascension. While a spiritual kingdom alone can certainly last forever, and while the gospel message of the kingdom has been spreading to cover the entire earth, if God's kingdom is only spiritual and was established and functioning when Jesus rose again and ascended into heaven, can that kingdom be described as decisively eliminating and replacing all kingdoms of the world? A simple reading of the text does not lead you to that conclusion, especially since we have a couple thousand years of history behind us. Plus, Rome did not disappear in the flash of an eye and never to be seen again. It went on for hundreds, and depending if you count the eastern portion, another 1,000+ years. Such a slow disappearance from the world stage is hardly the single blow to the empires of the globe, literally leaving them in the dust. History and current geopolitical systems do not fit the description of us living under a visible kingdom put in place by God and ruled by his appointed Son. People will say so. Remember, Jesus said something about in the last days, people will say, I am Messiah. So we're left with either Rome is not the fourth kingdom, and there are plenty of people who study the Bible say that's not it at all. In fact, it was the Greek Empire. That was the last one. Or something still ahead for us. Come with me to chapter 7. It's now around 553 BC. 50 years after Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the enormous statue. If Daniel was 15 when he was first taken captive, he would be in his mid to late 60s at this point. By 553 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had been dead for several years, and his descendants had taken over for him. The new ruler, Nabonidus, was in place, but since he went off to war, he delegated his son, Belshazzar, to be in control. And up until now, it was Daniel who interpreted the visions of the rulers. So the first time in his life, now in his mid to late 60s, God gives him a vision. And this time God has to give him the interpretation directly for his own dream. In Daniel 7, the prophet receives a vision, not of a statue, but of 4 beasts. Daniel 7:1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each from the others, different from the others, came up out of the sea." Now, in biblical writings, the sea often refers to not a body of water, but the sea of humanity. And out of the world population, these creatures come. It turns out that I'm not making this up. The interpretation given to us a few verses later confirms that this great sea is a reference to the people of the earth, not an actual body of water. The first beast was like a lion. It had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on its 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. Strange. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. I was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." After that, I looked, and there was before me another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. While the images are different between chapter 2 and chapter 7, we will see a correlation between Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's vision. And like the first dream in chapter 2, the focus once again centers on the 4th part of the image. Verse 7. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there was before me a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth and crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Don't look up the pictures online for this. They're really cartoonish. I tried getting you one. I was like, nah, you're going to laugh. So we'll just keep it in your head as it is, all right? As I looked, the thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch. Because of the boastful words the horn was speaking, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there was before me one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Now, if some of these words sound familiar to you, it's probably because Daniel 7 is one chapter that is used as a route to expand these pictures later in the Bible. The Ancient of Days is God the Father, and Jesus chose the title Son of Man for himself as we go through the Gospels. Daniel 7:13 specifically is the most quoted verse from the book of Daniel in the New Testament. As interpreted by conservative expositors, the vision of Daniel provides the most comprehensive and detailed prophecy of future events to be found anywhere in the Old Testament. Jesus tells us in the Gospels that this was the picture that he will fulfill when he comes again. So let's clarify something else as it comes to interpreting prophetic or apocalyptic images such as these. We take an interpretive approach that's known as futurist. We look at the writings such as these found in Daniel and looking to understand their meaning to their original audience in their original context, historically and otherwise. And then we look at the next to see if the apocalyptic images are explained somewhere else in the book. As I've mentioned before, most of the time the symbols and images are given an interpretation right then and there. And then, since we have the advantage of looking back over human history, we can look back to examine to see if or where such prophecy has been fulfilled. When we cannot see it, or we cannot see it in its complete form, we generally look forward to a day when it will be fulfilled as it's worded. There will be a kingdom that will replace all the other ones. The images of the rock and the beast are simply to get our heads to understand the concept. And the same approach, this futurist approach, applies to the 4 parts of the statue in chapter 2 and the 4 beasts in chapter 7. Now, fortunately, God gives us the interpretation, and he gives it to Daniel right away. The 4-part statue and the 4 beasts are different dreams, but the explanation that God gives draws a parallel between the two. Each kingdom is represented by a king, so whatever happens to the kingdom happens to the king. Whatever happens to the king happens to the kingdom. From what we know now of world history, it's not too difficult to recognize the first 3 beasts as the same kingdoms from Nebuchadnezzar's statue. As the head of gold and the lion or eagle combination, Nebuchadnezzar was unequaled as a leader. The hanging gardens of Babylon were known among the 7 wonders of the world. And yet, as you read through the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar did not see all that he had as a recognition that God had given it to him. So God uses Daniel to warn Nebuchadnezzar of his pride before his reign would be taken from him in chapter 4. You can read that at some point. It's a pretty quick read. There's only 12 chapters in Daniel. But if you want to go find out a little more details about these things, please do. You see, the Babylonian ruler rejected this warning, and he became a madman, just like God said. For 7 years, he wandered in the wilderness. He became hairy and gross and long fingernails and matted hair that he looked like an eagle with feathers, until he recognized that God is the one who raises and lowers kings according to his own pleasure. And Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler represented by the lion with the eagle's wings, did have his wings plucked. As he went through that humiliating experience, got his head on straight and came out worshiping the God who actually gave it to him in the first place. The second creature that represented the bear, or resembled the bear, corresponds to the Medo-Persian Empire, where Persia assumed control over the kingdom of the Medes. It was a little bit more dominant. You got the bear kind of standing up a little bit on one side. Could have been the effect of Persia being the greater influence in the two. And for nearly 200 years after they took over Babylon, the Medo-Persians expanded their territory and devoured people, groups, by conquest. The third beast is like a leopard, swift, as an animal of prey already, without anything special, but now we've got additional wings. So you've got this warp speed, if you will, option. The 4 heads reveal a division in 4 different directions or 4 different leaders. Historically, the closest kingdom we have to fit both the timeline and the description is that of Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire. Before Hitler's Blitzkrieg, Alexander expanded his reign by using his own lightning war and taking over in 4 directions of the earth everything he could get his hands on. But Alexander did not live very long. And after his death, his kingdom was actually divided by 4 of his generals, 4 heads, 2 of which became more widely known. And those divisions remained for a couple of hundred years until around 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem, ending the final years of Jewish independence and destroying the remnants of the Seleucid kingdom, which controlled Israel. After that, the Greek Empire fizzled. Rome came on to play next. But it wasn't swift in coming to power like Greece. In fact, it took them decades as they slowly and meticulously took pieces of Alexander's empire for themselves, until they controlled the known world around the Mediterranean Sea. And the iron is definitely a picture of the Roman Empire. It most closely fits the way they treated people who rejected. You either come under their foot or you die. But as we move further into the interpretation of this 4th beast, there are things that do not fit with the history of the Roman Empire. That 10-toe stage is simultaneous. That is, the kingdoms existed side by side and were destroyed by one sudden catastrophic blow. Nothing like that has yet occurred in history. It's clear from this passage that this 4th kingdom, somehow related to ancient Rome, is a kingdom that only appears at the end of days based on what happens next in the text. So what of this issue of the Roman Empire? In chapter 2, the legs were iron, but the 10 toes were a mixture of iron and clay. While Rome ruled a western and an eastern portion, which might be represented by the 2 legs, that's one option, there was not a time when Rome was a united kingdom with 10 nations and 10 rulers. Caesar eventually became the only one to follow. And Daniel explained that they were a confederation that served a common purpose for a time, but they ultimately weren't united in their larger purposes. But the differences between those 10 parts were too great to allow that confederation to exist united. As the toes are partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture, will not remain united, any more than iron mixes with clay. Here in chapter 7, as we look at Daniel's dreams at the 4 beasts, the last one is characterized by 10 horns. We're supposed to see the parallel. Oh, wait, 10 toes, 10 horns. Yeah, you're on the same page. That's the way it's supposed to work. Yet one of these horns uproots 3 and replaces himself, growing large enough to take control over everybody that's left. This little horn becomes larger. He has an arrogance and self-love that is unmatched, including blaspheming God. And as we examine the text and history, since the time that this was given to us, we've concluded that whatever Gentile kingdom this thing is, it's going to be in place when Jesus returns and somehow related to ancient Rome, made up of some alliance between nations. Now this picture, we said, well, I thought we already had Rome up and gone, and we've got another one of maybe another one to come. This can be called a double fulfillment. We talked about this a few weeks ago, where Rome did fulfill part of Daniel's vision during the original Roman Empire, but the other aspects of this 10-part kingdom is still ahead. Another way to look at such prophecies is by using a term called telescoping. When you look at the valley between these mountains in the distance, they appear to be side by side and the same distance from where you are standing. It's not until you begin to journey towards those mountains that you discover they're separated by a great distance. They just appear to be on the same geometric plane from where you stand. The first and second coming of Jesus Christ fits that picture. You see, they had been developing in the Old Testament an idea of who this Messiah promised one was. They saw him in the Old Testament scriptures as priest and servant, savior, judge, warrior, healer, and king. But they could not distinguish from their vantage point those roles that Jesus would perform. We know now that he came to perform some and still has yet to come to do the rest. And this dynamic of seeing things in close proximity, yet actually being a great distance from one another, is called telescoping. It's also true of the picture given to us concerning the 4th and 5th kingdom. So let's keep going. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. Yeah, me too. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. He grabbed hold of one of the angels that was attending God. So the angel told me and gave me the interpretations of these things. Here it is. The 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth. No surprise there. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever, if you missed it the first time. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying with its iron teeth and bronze claws. We didn't hear that before. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on the head and about the other horn that came up before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on the earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the time set and the laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole of heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the rulers will worship and obey him. Now, it's clear from this passage that this last Gentile kingdom is somehow related to ancient Rome, is a real kingdom. that only appears at the end of days. So between the image of the statue and the final beast, God has given us an interpretation of those images. The last kingdom is made up of 10 parts. However, this little horn quickly rises to take over 3 and grows large enough to take over control of the rest. Again, there's not a place historically where we've ever seen something like that happen, especially when coupled with the description of that specific ruler and what comes right after that. If you already know this, then you understand why Christians have been watching the European Union with such fascination, trying to find out, okay, we got 10 yet? Oh, lost another one. There's 7 now, 12. They have a very tenuous alliance, and it's not an unfair thing to look there to find out what's going on. But while we have only looked at this briefly, do you see how the apocalyptic images given to us are explained in the text so we don't have to make wild guesses? The same references carry into the last book of the Bible, by the way, as John in the book of Revelation also tells us about a 10-nation confederation and the Antichrist who rules them. Some of the details can be debated, I'll grant you that for sure, and several options may be offered, but the core of the revelation is clear. There will be a time, beginning in Daniel's day, when 4 consecutive kingdoms rule the world. The older empires would be absorbed by the next one. They didn't die right away, as their culture and ideas came to influence the next kingdom in power. History has shown that the earlier empires did exactly that. You still talk about Rome and Greece now, do you not? Our vocabulary has been influenced by them as well as not. Not completely dead. But a 4th empire will arise unlike any other before it, and it will be a confederation from the remnants of Rome. Out of the 4th kingdom, an evil leader will come. He will oppress the saints, specifically the Jews, speak blasphemy against God, try to change the worship practices of the Jewish people. That's the times referenced in the earlier passage. He will take control over all nations, governments, and people of the earth, and he will rule for 3.5 years, times, time, and half a time. Whatever final configuration this is, this wicked individual will reign and rule over the earth until the time of Christ's return. That's what Daniel teaches. The character of the last beast and the kingdom represented by that beast has not had a historical precedent. But the entire system ends when the stone, not cut by human hands, shatters the iron clay feet and forces the entire statue to disintegrate. All will be eliminated when this 5th kingdom enters world history. It's unlike any other. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were broken into pieces at the same time, and it became like chaff on the threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was the one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Do you see the hope that Daniel held out to his people reading this or hearing this for the first time? The Ancient of Days had all the authority handed over to the Son of Man. The saints, the angels, and the nations of the earth come to worship the Son of Man. While Daniel would not have had a name for him, this is clearly a messianic picture. But until that day comes when Daniel described, or what he described as a period that became known as the time of the Gentiles. It began with Babylon early in the first part of the 6th century. And we believe that the time of the Gentiles has continued right up to the present moment. We're living in it now, but it won't last forever. It's a period of history where non-Jewish rulers and nations around the globe are trying to control and conquer the promised land. Sound familiar? In the New Testament, Jesus not only confirms that Daniel's writing refer to what's still ahead, but Jesus specifically speaks of this period of time that we're living in. He was born into it under the Roman dominion, and he said it would remain until he comes again. Here it is, Luke chapter 21. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that's been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Daniel was able to assure his people that Israel would come home. And they did, in fact, come home 70 years, just like the Bible said. But it wasn't complete. They were promised a future kingdom that would replace all other human kingdoms, and Israel was at the center of this promise. But the glory of their land and the fulfillment of that kingdom would not come right away. Jesus confirms it. As New Testament believers, we're given a picture of the end of the Gentile kingdom. They are replaced by the kingdom of God coming to earth. And since we have the rest of the Bible to further clarify this picture, we know that Daniel was witnessing Jesus' coronation, coming as king, taking his rightful place as Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Now, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the details, don't worry. We're going to cover these things again as we go through the next 2 months. What's important is that you walk away as Daniel's listeners walked away from these two amazing visions, knowing this: the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets them over anyone he wishes. Let's pray. Father, thank you for giving us a chance to walk through this amazing work and for putting people like that on the face of the earth to do your work in times past that give us a wealth of information that those who desperately wanted to follow you did not have way back in history. With all this information comes tremendous responsibility, and I pray that this series would allow us to take that seriously, to be willing to discuss it in our small groups a little bit more, to try to get our heads around it and not be fearful. All Scripture being God-breathed, there's value here too. And that you would give us the ability to get past the blood and gore and the scary parts to get to the part that Daniel's communicating here. And we'll continue to communicate in his book and John and his. This week belongs to you. Our encounters with people are yet to be seen, but I pray that you'd allow us to be a light to them as you desire us to be for your kingdom. Amen.